The Terminus systems had a long tradition of swallowing ships whole. Pirate ambushes, slaver runs gone wrong, drive core failures in the dark between stars, the void beyond. Council space was a graveyard that kept its secrets well. So when the Cerberus deep space freighter Meridian Claws missed its scheduled check-in near the Hourglass Nebula, the elusive man's operations team logged it as a probable loss and moved on. Ships disappeared in the terminus. That was simply the cost of doing business at the edge of civilization. 12 days later, a Cerberus recovery frigate found it. The Meridian Claws was still intact, or at least the hull was, drifting without power at the coordinates of its last transmission, running dark against the dim red glow of a cooling nebula. It looked from a distance like any other dead ship floating in the black. Salvageable, even. The recovery team docked at the port airlock and immediately noticed two things. First, the internal atmosphere was intact, life. Support had been running until very recently, and the air cycled into their suits smelled of burned metal and something else. Something organic and sharp and wrong. Second, the corridors weren't empty. They weren't occupied by the crew, either. The crew was gone. Not dead. Not in any way the recovery team could immediately classify. Their equipment remained. Weapons racked on the walls. Omni tools still active on workbenches. A half-eaten meal still warm in the mess. But the people who had owned those things were simply absent, as though they'd stepped out of their lives mid-sentence. What filled the corridors instead were the walls themselves, or what had replaced them. Every surface from Deck 3 forward had been consumed and rebuilt. The original carbon fiber panels, the synthetic polymer piping, the EZO conduit sheathing, all of it had been processed and reassembled into something that looked like circuitry, rendered in 3 dimensions. Geometric lattices of small interlocking blocks covered the walls, the floor, the ceiling, branching through every compartment in organized, purposeful patterns. They were gray-silver, roughly cubic, each one about the size of a fist, each one connected to the next by joints that moved with a slow and deliberate clicking, sound that echoed through the dead ship like the ticking of an enormous clock. The recovery team's point man reached out and touched one. It detached from the wall in a single fluid motion, extruded 4 segmented legs from its underside, and ran up his arm toward his helmet. He screamed. His squadmates opened fire. The burst of mass accelerator. Rounds tore through the block and knocked it to the floor, where it lay still. But the sound of the gunfire rippled outward through the lattice structures on every wall. And as the echoes died, the clicking stopped. A silence fell over the ship that was somehow worse than the noise had been. Then, from deeper in the vessel, from Deck 3, from Deck 4, from the engineering bay and the cargo hold and the crew quarters, new sounds began. Thousands of small feet on metal floors, moving fast, moving toward them. The recovery team made it back to the airlock. 2 of them made it back to the frigate. The frigate transmitted a single emergency burst to the nearest Cerberus relay before something severed its communications array. And then it, too, went silent. The elusive man received the transmission 6 hours later. He read it twice, lit a cigarette, and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of Kronos, stationed at the star burning below. Then he made 3 calls in rapid succession, one to Miranda Lawson, one to his research division lead on the Hourglass project, and one to a contact embedded in Citadel CCC who owed him a favor that had been accruing interest for 7 years. The calls were brief. The elusive man was not a man who wasted words when the situation had already communicated everything important on its own. The situation was communicating quite clearly. Something had arrived in terminus space through the dark energy anomaly that his research team had been prodding for the past 4 months. Something that consumed technology and rebuilt it according to its own design. Something that had processed the crew of the Meridian Claws in a manner the recovery team's footage hadn't fully captured, but the thermal imaging in the final frames showed mass displacement in the cargo hold consistent with biological material being broken down at the molecular level, not killed, processed. He pulled up the tactical projection of the Hourglass Nebula and traced the drift pattern of the Meridian Claws back to its origin point, a secondary mass relay in the Ocean system that had been dormant for the last 300 years. His research team had been using controlled, dark energy pulses to study its inactive core. For months of probing something ancient and incomprehensible, with human science and Prothean-derived tools. In retrospect, it was remarkable that only one ship had been lost. In retrospect, the Meridian Clause was not the loss. The Meridian Clause was the warning. On Omega, at the outer docking ring of the station's C block, the district Arya Tlok, controlled with considerably less attention than she gave her inner wards. A cargo hauler registered to a Batarian freight company had just docked with 3 containers that weren't on its manifest. The dock workers who opened the first container didn't report what they found inside. Their Omni tools went dark 11 seconds after the container was unsealed. The clicking sound that emerged from the dock carried through the station's ventilation network for 4 full minutes before anyone in Area's security office thought to investigate. By then, the outer docking ring had gone quiet in a way that Omega, loud, violent, perpetually alive with the noise of 10,000 species living and dying in close proximity, had never been quiet before. The replicators had arrived, and they were very, very hungry. If you want to see more characters enter the Mass Effect galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. The galaxy remembers. Omega did not scare easily. The station had survived Turian blockades, Krogan gang wars, a Vorsha plague that burned through the lower Warrens for 6 weeks before. Area's enforcers contained it with methods that no Council Health Board would ever officially sanction. It had survived mercenary coups, Blue Sun's power grabs, Eclipse assassination campaigns, and one particularly catastrophic incident involving a rogue 6 in the lower mining district that Arya still refused to discuss publicly. The station was built from the bones of a worked-out asteroid, held together by salvage, willpower, and the absolute authority of one Asari, who had been running this corner of the terminus for 3 centuries. Omega endured because the people on it were too stubborn, too desperate, or too dangerous to die quietly. The outer docking ring went dark in 40 minutes. It didn't happen like a battle. Battles had fronts, had lines, had moments where one side pressed and the other held or broke. This had none of that geometry. CSEC had no presence on Omega. Area's enforcers were the law here. And the first squad she sent to the outer ring reported contact. Reported that conventional weapons were having no effect on the targets. Reported that the targets were moving through the walls. And then stopped reporting. The second squad she sent came back. 2 of the 6 made it back. They described what they'd seen in fragmented, overlapping sentences. And one of them kept looking at his hands as though checking that his fingers were still his own. The replicators, though no one on Omega had a name for them yet, had emerged from the 3 unsealed containers and immediately begun doing what they did, consuming. The docking ring's infrastructure was dense with exactly the kind of complexity they thrived on. Power conduits, atmospheric regulators, ESO distribution nodes connecting to Omega's vast underbelly of drive systems and gravity plating. Each block dismantled what it touched, processed it, and built more of itself. Each new block joined the network and began consuming in turn. The mathematics of it were straightforward and catastrophic. Every cycle of replication produced more units than the last, and each unit required only raw material and time. Omega had an abundance of both. Arya Tlok stood on the upper balcony of Afterlife and watched the tactical display her 6 was projecting. Across the club's main floor, the enforcer teams reduced to static icons. The spread of the anomaly, marked in spreading red across the outer ring schematic, and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than most species lived. Not fear exactly. Something colder and more analytical than fear. The recognition of a threat that did not fit any category she had previously assigned to threats. She'd seen the footage from the surviving enforcers. She'd watched the mass accelerator round strike the targets and accomplish nothing beyond mild kinetic disruption. She'd watched the targets reassemble around the damage within seconds. Watched them flow through ventilation gaps too small for any organic body. Watched them climb over each other in coordinated swarms that moved like liquid and hit like freight. She'd been running Omega long enough to know the difference between a problem you solve by throwing more guns at it and a problem that ate your guns. She opened a channel to her senior enforcer captain. Seal the transit corridors between C Block and the main ring. Blow the connecting tunnels if you have to. That'll strand about 3,000 people in C Block. Yes, Arya said. It will. She closed the channel and opened another. This one to a frequency she hadn't used in 8 months. A line that ran through 3 relay bounces before, terminating at a receiver she had no official knowledge of. It rang twice before it was answered. Arya. The voice was smooth, unhurried, carrying the particular quality of a man who had never once in his life been surprised by a phone call. This is unexpected. I have a situation, Arya said. Something is consuming my station. Conventional weapons are ineffective. I need information about what I'm dealing with before I decide how to burn it out. A pause. Not hesitation, calculation. Describe the targets. She transmitted the enforcer footage. Another pause, longer this time. When the elusive man spoke again, his voice had acquired a very slight new quality, not alarm, but the adjacent thing, the recognition of a variable that had not been fully accounted for. I see. And you're calling me because your people found it first, Arya said. The Meridian clause disappeared near the Ocean relay 12 days ago. Whatever came through that anomaly hit your freighter before it hit my station, which means you already know something. And I want to know what you know before this spreads past C Block. The silence that followed was appreciative. The elusive man respected competence. He particularly respected it in people he hadn't underestimated in the first place. I'll share what I have. In exchange, you want a sample? Arya's voice was flat. I want containment data. What works, what doesn't, what they prioritize when given multiple targets. Omega is the perfect observation environment. Dense infrastructure, varied technology, multiple species. You'll learn things about these organisms in the next 6 hours that my researchers couldn't generate in 6 months. Arya looked at the spreading red on the tactical display. C Block had gone completely dark. The anomaly boundary was pressing against the corridor seals she'd just ordered blown. You're asking me to let them feed. I'm asking you to let them feed contained, while we both gather intelligence. The elusive man said. The alternative is you attempt to burn out a threat you don't understand with tools that demonstrably don't work, and in doing so, drive them into the main ring faster. It was sound logic. She hated that it was sound logic. 6 hours, she said. Then I burn C Block entirely. Life support, power, atmosphere. Everything. Agreed. Another pause. One more thing, Arya. The ESO conduits, are they in the affected zone? She checked the schematic. The outer ring's main ESO distribution trunk ran directly through C Block's infrastructure spine. Yes. Watch them carefully, the elusive man said. Specifically, watch whether the targets attempt to interface with the ESO nodes or simply consume them. That distinction may be the most important piece of data either of us collects today. He ended the call. Arya stood with the dead channel in her ear and watched the red spread on her display and thought about what kind of entity would be more dangerous if it learned to interface with element 0 rather than simply eating it. The clicking sound had reached the corridor seals now. She could hear it through the station walls, thousands of tiny feet on metal, moving in perfect, patient coordination. Not frantic, not aggressive in any emotional sense. Simply purposeful, simply hungry. In the 3 centuries Arya Tloke had held Omega, she had never once evacuated the station. She began issuing the order for the main ring's civilian population to move toward the inner wards, just in case, just as a precaution. She told herself it was a precaution. The Cerberus research station designated Lamprey 7 was not on any official chart. It existed in the technical sense, a converted mining platform, anchored to a nickel-iron asteroid, in the outer belt of the Hourglass Nebula, staffed by 43 researchers, 12 security personnel, and a 6th system sophisticated enough to manage the station's ESO containment arrays without constant human oversight. It had been operational for 11 months. Its primary purpose the study of the dormant Ocean relay and the dark energy anomaly that had been building around it since the relay's partial reactivation. For months prior, the elusive man had invested considerable resources in Lamprey 7. He had invested those resources because he believed the anomaly represented something Unprecedented, a window into energy dynamics that predated the Protheans, possibly predated the relay network itself. He had been correct about it being unprecedented. He had been incorrect about what that meant for his investment. Miranda Lawson received the station's distress signal at 0340. Ship time aboard the Vindicator, a Cerberus frigate running dark in the nebula's outer shell, 3 light hours from Lamprey 7's position. The signal was automated, the station's 6 broadcasting a standard emergency burst on loop, the kind that triggered when the biological crew dropped below a minimum threshold of active Omni-tool signatures. It was the signal a station sent when there was no one left to send a message manually. She arrived at Lamprey 7 4 hours later with a 6-person strike team, full combat protocols, and the particular expression she wore when she already suspected what she was going to find but intended to be professionally thorough about confirming it anyway. The docking approach looked normal. The exterior of the station was intact. The airlock cycled correctly. The atmosphere inside was breathable. The station beyond the airlock was unrecognizable. The transformation was more complete here than the footage from the Meridian Claws had suggested possible. At the freighter, the replicators had consumed and rebuilt approximately 40% of the vessel's internal structure in the time available. Here, with 11 months of advanced research equipment, containment arrays, and the particular bounty of a facility designed to study exotic energy phenomena, they had done something far more thorough. Every surface in every corridor had been rebuilt into the same geometric lattice structure. But here the lattice was more complex, more layered, exhibiting branching architectures that bore a troubling resemblance to neural network diagrams. The blocks themselves were larger in some areas, smaller in others, as though the swarm had learned to differentiate components by function, rather than simply replicating uniform units. Miranda moved through the facility with her team in tight formation, scanning continuously. The clicking was present but distant, deep in the station's core, concentrated around what had been the primary research lab. The corridors closer to the airlock were still, not abandoned still, waiting still. "They know we're here," said Operative Chun, scanning his motion tracker with the focused attention of a man trying very hard not to show that his hands wanted to shake. "They've known since the airlock," Miranda said. She kept her voice at the same temperature she used for mission briefings and difficult conversations with the elusive, man-controlled and precise. "They're not approaching." "Why not?" She had a theory about that, and she didn't like it. The replicators on Omega had pursued every organic presence in C-Block aggressively, according to Area's transmitted data. Here, with a strike team that represented a comparatively small biomass against the station's remaining technological bounty, they were holding position, which suggested they were capable of cost-benefit analysis, which suggested they were not simply consuming on instinct but making decisions about resource allocation, which meant they were thinking. She found what remained of the research team in Lab 3. The room had been the heart of the station's anomaly study. Floor-to-ceiling displays, 3 containment chambers, 2 quantum entanglement communicators, and enough sensor equipment to map the interior of a mass relay. The displays were dark. The containment chambers had been disassembled and rebuilt into something that Miranda's implants couldn't classify, a structure that bore the geometric replicator lattice aesthetic but incorporated the containment coils intact, threading them through the block matrix in a configuration that suggested deliberate preservation rather than consumption. Someone, or something, had looked at the coils and decided not to eat them. The research team's remains were in the corner of the room, all 43 of them. Miranda's medical scanner ran its analysis, and she studied the results for a long moment before she filed them away in the part of her mind she kept separate from operational focus. The tissue breakdown was unlike anything in her medical database. Not the pattern of conventional weapons, not thermal damage or kinetic trauma. The molecular structure had been systematically disassembled, carbon chains separated from nitrogen bonds in a process that was, from a purely biochemical standpoint, extraordinarily efficient. 43 people had been processed in approximately 6 hours. The replicators had used the biological material for something. The new lattice structures in the room were denser than those in the corridors, more complex. exhibiting what looked disturbingly like additional processing nodes integrated into the framework. She transmitted the scanner, data to the Vindicator and opened a channel to the elusive man. Lamprey 7 is a total loss, she said. The research team is gone. The facility has been converted. A pause. The EZO containment coils are intact and integrated into the new structure. They didn't consume the EZO arrays. They kept them. They're learning, the elusive man said. He sounded, if anything, more interested than alarmed. They couldn't interface with the EZO systems initially. Our earlier data from the Meridian clause suggested that. But 43 researchers with active Omni tools, 11 months of EZO research data in the station's 6 network, quantum entanglement communicator architecture. They processed the researchers and extracted the data, Miranda said. The words came out flat and precise, and she made sure they stayed that way. They learned EZO interface methodology from the research team's neural patterns. Presumably, yes. And the EZO coils they preserved are the first step toward mass effect field generation, the elusive man said. Which means we have a shorter timeline than I projected. Another pause. The sound of a cigarette being drawn. There's something else you should understand, Miranda. The replicators are currently a contained threat, Omega, the Meridian clause. Lamprey 7. But they're contained. Only because they haven't yet built a replication engine large enough to produce independent travel capability. The OSIN relay is still dormant. If they reach a functioning relay, they jump to every system in the network. Every system, every ship, every station, every planet with advanced technology. The elusive man's voice carried the weight of the calculation he'd already completed. We're not looking at a terminus problem, Miranda. We're looking at a galactic extinction event that makes the collector threat look like a border skirmish. Miranda was already walking back toward the airlock, her strike team falling in around her with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that the time for gathering intelligence had ended and the time for leaving had begun. Behind them, deeper in the station, the clicking sound had changed pitch, faster now, more complex. A sound less like machinery and more like something thinking out loud. I'm pulling out, she said. What's our next move? We need Commander Shepard, the elusive man said. It clearly cost him something to say it. Not as an asset, as a warning system. The Council needs to know about this before the replicators reach a functioning relay, and Shepard is currently the only person in this galaxy who the Council, the Alliance, and enough independent factions will actually listen to. A pause. Contact the Normandy. Tell Shepard that Cerberus has information about a new extinction-level threat. Tell him. A breath. Tell him we're asking, not ordering. He'll appreciate the distinction. Miranda stepped through the airlock into the clean dark of space and didn't look back at the station. He'll want to know why Cerberus was probing a dormant relay in the first place. Yes, the elusive man said. He will. Tell him the truth. We were looking for an advantage against the Reapers. Tell him we may have found something worse instead. The Normandy State Route 2 dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Hourglass Nebula with the particular combination of speed and caution that characterized every approach. Shepard ordered into unknown territory, fast enough to maintain tactical advantage, slow enough for EDI to build a complete sensor picture before anyone started making decisions they couldn't unmake. EDI had been building that sensor picture for the 11 minutes since Miranda's transmission arrived, and what she was assembling was making the blue light of her interface sphere pulse in patterns that Shepard had learned to read as the AI equivalent of controlled concern. Commander, EDI said, her voice carrying from the Galaxy map station to the cockpit where Shepard stood behind Joker's chair, watching the nebula resolve into detail on the forward displays. I've completed preliminary analysis of the data. Miranda Lawson transmitted alongside her briefing. I want to walk you through several elements that require immediate attention. Talk, Shepard said. The entities Cerberus has designated as the primary threat are self-replicating machines of non-local origin, meaning they did not originate in this galaxy, or if they did, they arrived through a mechanism that predates the relay network and leaves no record in any Prothean archive I can access. EDI paused in the way she did when organizing information, she found genuinely difficult to categorize. Their replication rate, based on the spread data from Omega and Lamprey 7, follows an exponential curve. The initial seed swarm that emerged from the OSIN anomaly was small, possibly as few as 40 individual units. Lamprey 7's conversion suggests that population has grown to somewhere between 80 and 120,000 units in approximately 12 days. Joker let out a slow breath. That's okay. That's a bad number. It becomes worse, EDI continued. The data from Lamprey 7 indicates they've successfully preserved and integrated ESO containment architecture into their structure. They couldn't interface with Mass Effect systems initially. They now can, at least in a rudimentary sense. Their learning curve is not linear, Commander. Each generation of replication incorporates improvements derived from assimilated technology and, according to Miranda's biological skin data, assimilated neural information from the research team. Shepard turned from the viewport. They extracted knowledge from the crew, from their neural patterns, yes. 43 researchers specializing in exodynamics, relay physics, and dark energy phenomena. The replicators have, in effect, consumed 11 months of advanced Mass Effect physics research in a single acquisition. EDI sphere pulsed. I calculate they will achieve basic mass effect field generation capability within 72 to 96 hours. Once they can generate mass effect fields independently, they can begin interfacing with relay systems. Once they interface with relay systems, they're everywhere, Shepard said. Everywhere simultaneously, yes. The relay network would function as a distribution mechanism, rather than a containment barrier. EDI paused again. Commander, I want to be precise about what I'm describing. The replicators don't appear to have a strategic goal in the way organic civilizations define strategy. They don't want territory or political power or resources in the conventional sense. They want to replicate the entire Mass Effect galaxy, its ships, its stations, its planets, its technology, and its organic populations represents raw material for that singular purpose. They are not an army. They are a process. The briefing room filled as Shepard walked through the CIC. Gurus arrived first, his colony-scarred face carrying the expression he reserved for tactical problems he was already trying to solve before he sat down. Tali followed, her environmental suit's filters working quietly in the recycled air, her posture broadcasting the particular tension of an engineer who had just been handed data that violated her assumptions about what machines could do. Mordin came in reading from his Omni tool already, annotating EDI's transmission with his own calculations, muttering in the compressed shorthand he used when his brain was moving faster than normal conversation allowed. Shepard put the Lamprey 7 footage on the main display. Let it run without commentary. The room watched the geometric lattice structures, the integrated ESO coils, Miranda's scanner data showing the organized molecular breakdown of 43 human beings. Mordin stopped muttering. That alone told Shepard everything about the severity. Thoughts, Shepard said. Gurus spoke first. Conventional weapons are ineffective. The Omega footage confirms that mass accelerator rounds achieve kinetic disruption, but the targets reassemble, which means our standard combat doctrine is useless against them. He leaned forward, mandibles tight. We need to understand what does work before we get anywhere near these things. The data suggests high-energy, sustained fire may be more effective than kinetic impacts, Tali said, pulling up her own analysis on her Omni tool. Mass accelerators shave particles and propel them. The impact is fast and localized. A sustained energy discharge, something that disrupts the block-to-block connectivity, rather than breaking individual units, might prevent reassembly. She paused. But we don't have weapons designed for that. We need to improvise. Biotics? Shepard asked. EDI responded before anyone else could. Unknown. No biotic has engaged the replicators yet. The Mass Effect field generation involved in biotic abilities might interact with replicator block connectivity in interesting ways, potentially disruptive, potentially providing them with useful data about biotic field dynamics. I would recommend caution before committing biotic assets without more information, So we don't know if our best close combat option helps or feeds them, Gurus said. Correct, EDI said. There is one additional element from Miranda's transmission that I haven't addressed yet. She shifted the display to the structural analysis of Lamprey 7's converted research lab, the configuration the replicators built around the preserved EZO coils. I've been modeling it against known mass effect engineering principles. A pause. It's crude, very crude, but it's recognizable. They're building towards something that functions on the same principles as a mass relay. Not a relay, not yet, not close, but the same underlying architecture. They're not just learning to use mass effect fields. They're trying to build their own version of the technology that defines this galaxy's infrastructure. The room was quiet for a moment, in the way rooms got quiet when information arrived that reorganized everything. How long before that crude version becomes functional? Shepard asked. At their current replication and learning rate, EDI said, 14 days. Perhaps less if they acquire additional EZO sources. The migrant fleet, Tali said quietly. The words landed in the room like a stone in still water. Every head turned toward her. She was staring at the display, her faceplate unreadable, but her voice had dropped into a register. Shepard recognized the voice she used when she was doing math she desperately wanted to get wrong. 50,000 ships, the largest concentration of dense, complex technology in the terminus systems outside of the Citadel itself. Multiple EZO drives per vessel, active mass effect systems, decades of accumulated engineering, data in every ship's six network. She looked at Shepard. If the replicators reach the migrant fleet before we contain them, they won't need 14 days. They won't need 7. Where's the fleet right now? Chris asked. Admiralty Board logged their position 3 days ago, EDI said. They're running a resupply corridor through the Shrike Abyssal. At standard drift, their outer vessels are currently a pause that felt almost reluctant. Approximately 4.2 light hours from the replicator anomaly zones. Projected expansion boundary. Tali stood up from the table. I need to warn them. You need to do more than warn them, Mordin said. He'd been silent through the entire briefing, which for Mordin was its own kind of alarm. He set his Omni tool down on the table and looked at the display with the expression he wore when a problem had already moved past the stage where he liked the available solutions. Warning insufficient without containment plan. Migrant fleet receives warning. Attempts to flee. Replicators pursue faster replicating population. Fleet attempts to fight. Weapons ineffective. Lose ships. Lose technology. Accelerate replicator growth. Need third option. He looked at Shepard. Need option that makes fleet a problem for replicators rather than a resource. You're talking about using the fleet as bait, Gurus said. Talking about using the fleet as controlled environment. Mordin corrected. Difference is meaningful. Bait implies sacrifice. Controlled environment implies management. He picked his Omni tool back up. Need more data first. Need to understand what replicators avoid, not just what they consume. Every predator has a version. Every process has an inhibitor. He was already walking toward the door. Going to work. Have preliminary findings in 4 hours. Recommend Shepard contacts Admiralty Board immediately. Also recommend contacting Elusive Man for full Lamprey 7 research. Archive. His researchers studied anomaly for 4 months. Data may contain inhibitor candidates. He left. The door slid shut behind him. Shepard looked at the display, the nebula, the spreading contamination zones, the migrant fleet's position relative to the expansion boundary, and made the calculation that the situation required. EDI, open a channel to Admiral Shalaran Vass, Tunbei on the migrant fleet. Priority transmission. Shepard paused. And get me the Elusive Man on a secondary channel. Tell him we're calling in every piece of Lamprey 7 data he has. Commander, EDI said, the Elusive Man will want something in return. He always does, Shepard said. This time he'll take no for an answer. Because the alternative is a galaxy with nothing left in it for Cerberus to be pro-human about. The Normandy State Route 2 dropped out of FTL at the edge of the hourglass. Nebula with its stealth systems, cycling down from a 3-hour dark run. And Commander Shepard stood at the galaxy map with Miranda's transmission, playing on loop and the particular stillness he got when a situation had moved beyond complicated into something that required a different category of thinking entirely. EDI had been running analysis since the transmission arrived. The ship's AI occupied a unique position in these moments, capable of processing the tactical implications of new data faster than any organic crew member while simultaneously lacking the visceral reaction that made humans want to pace, swear, or throw something. She presented her findings in the same measured tone she used for navigation updates and enemy capability assessments, which Shepard had come to appreciate as its own kind of comfort. EDI's calm was not indifference. It was precision, based on the footage transmitted by Miranda Lawson and the sensor data from Lamprey 7. I have constructed a preliminary profile of the entities, EDI said, projecting a rotating model above the galaxy map, the block form structure of a replicator unit, reconstructed from the camera feeds. They are entirely inorganic, composed of self-replicating modular units that function both independently and as components of a larger collective intelligence. Replication rate, extrapolating from the consumption timeline at Lamprey 7, suggests a doubling cycle of approximately 4 hours given sufficient raw material. 4 hours, Joker said from the cockpit. His voice had the specific quality of a man doing math he didn't want to finish. So whatever came through that anomaly has been in this galaxy for approximately 18 days, EDI completed. Beginning from a seed population we cannot precisely determine, but estimating conservatively from the Meridian Clause timeline. The current total unit count is in the hundreds of thousands, possibly more, depending on how much of Omega's outer ring they've consumed. Gurus leaned against the galaxy map terminal with his arms crossed, mandibles pressed, flat in the Turian expression that translated roughly as "this is a significant problem, and I'm deciding how significant." Kinetic barriers? Ineffective at stopping individual units, EDI said. Mass accelerator rounds provide temporary kinetic disruption, but units reassemble within seconds. The barrier technology deflects projectiles. Replicator blocks are not projectiles in the conventional sense. They move through gaps, around barriers, over obstacles. Kinetic barriers were not designed to stop something that treats physical obstructions as raw material. Biotics? Liera asked from across the room. She'd pulled up her own display and was running the footage alongside EDI's analysis with the focused intensity of someone cross-referencing everything against Prothean databases she carried in memory. Unknown efficacy. No biotic engagement with replicator units has been recorded yet. However, EDI paused in a way that had become her tell for information she found particularly significant. The footage from Lamprey 7's final hours shows the replicator units demonstrating altered behavior around the station's ESO containment arrays. Specifically, they ceased standard consumption protocols and shifted to what I can only describe as study behavior, examination without immediate disassembly, integration of intact ESO components into new structures. Shepard had been quiet through the briefing. He looked up now. They're learning ESO. They appear to be attempting to understand mass effect field generation. Yes, EDI said. The research team's neural patterns were processed, their knowledge of ESO physics extracted and integrated into the swarm's collective data. They are not yet capable of generating mass effect fields independently. But the trajectory is clear. The silence that followed had weight. Everyone in the room understood what EDI wasn't saying directly. The way you understood the shape of something large by the shadow it cast. A self-replicating machine intelligence that could consume any technology it encountered was a catastrophic threat. A self-replicating machine intelligence that could consume any technology it encountered. An interface with mass effect fields that could potentially use mass relays, generate FDL travel, project kinetic barriers of its own, was something the galaxy didn't have a word for yet. Tali, Shepard said. She was already at her station. Suit's environmental indicators showing the elevated respiration rate she got when something threatened the migrant fleets. 50,000 ships. I heard, she said. A technology-consuming swarm with exponential replication, moving toward ESO interface capability, somewhere in the terminus systems where the migrant fleet's outer patrol routes run. A pause. Shepard. Our ships are the single densest concentration of technology in this part of the galaxy. If they reach us, they won't, Shepard said. It was the voice he used when he hadn't yet figured out how something was going to be true, but had already decided it was going to be true. Tali had learned to find it simultaneously infuriating and reassuring. EDI, what stops them? There has to be something. From the Stargate database fragments, recovered from the Lamprey 7 anomaly's energy signature, EDI said, I have been able to partially reconstruct the origin parameters of the entities. In their native universe, they were defeated through a combination of electromagnetic pulse weapons tuned to specific frequencies, a unique energy weapon derived from a technology called an ancient power source, and, most relevantly, a disruptor wave that interfered with the replication signal binding individual units to the collective. So they have a frequency, Gurus said. They had a frequency in their native universe, yes. Whether that frequency translates to this universe's physics remains untested. The ESO-heavy environment of Mass Effect space may have altered their fundamental resonance during transit. Shepard nodded slowly, processing. So we need to test it. And to test it, we need to get close to them. He looked around the room. I'm also going to need the Council to authorize a quarantine of the Hourglass Nebula before this gets past the terminus. Which means I need to brief them. Which means another lecture about human overreach, Gurus said. My favorite. The Council will require substantial evidence before authorizing a quarantine that encompasses 3 terminus systems, EDI noted, particularly given that doing so would require cooperation with factions they don't officially acknowledge. The migrant fleet, Omega's independent operators, potentially Cerberus assets. They'll authorize it, Shepard said, when they understand the alternative. He pulled up the footage from Lamprey 7 on the Galaxy Maps main display, the corridors rebuilt into alien geometry, the ESO coils threaded through crystalline lattice structures, the corner of Lab 3 with the scanner data that EDI had carefully labeled biological material, fully processed in precise blue text. He let the footage run for a moment before stopping it on the final frame. The research station's exterior, intact and dark, looking from the outside, like nothing more than a dead facility, in a quiet part of space. Brief the Council, he said. Show them this. Then tell them I'm going to Omega to get a direct look at what we're dealing with, and that I need Spectre authorization to act unilaterally in terminus space if the situation develops faster than Council deliberation can accommodate. He paused. Word it more diplomatically than that. I will endeavor to translate it into something the counselors will find persuasive, rather than insubordinate, EDI said. Also tell them, Shepard hesitated for just a moment. Tell them this isn't the Collectors. This isn't Cerberus. This isn't anything in their threat database. Tell them if they want to debate jurisdiction while this thing learns to use mass relays. They're welcome to that debate, but they should be aware that the Replicators won't wait for the vote to conclude. He looked at the frozen image of Lamprey 7 for another second, then closed the display. We move in 4 hours. Get some rest. He glanced at Tali. Plot. A course that keeps us well clear of the migrant fleet's outer patrol routes. I don't want them anywhere near the Hourglass Nebula yet. Tali's suit indicators showed her respiration settling slightly, not because she felt better about the situation, because having a course of action was better than not having one. And Shepard had that effect on rooms, not by pretending things weren't dangerous, but by making the danger feel like something you could move toward, rather than something moving toward you. She began plotting the course. Behind her, the Normandy turned its nose toward Omega, and in the deep dark of the Hourglass Nebula, something that had crossed the boundary between universes continued its patient, exponential work. The Quarian migrant fleet ran on a philosophy of necessary paranoia. 50,000 ships carrying the entirety of a displaced species through hostile space had no margin for optimism. Every docking procedure was a potential contamination vector. Every new contact was a potential threat. Every system they passed through was evaluated not for opportunity, but for exit routes, because the fleet's entire strategic doctrine was built on the understanding that if something went wrong, the only acceptable outcome was survival of the fleet. And survival of the fleet meant knowing exactly how to run before the fight became unwinnable. The Admiralty Board had been making these calculations for 300 years. They were very good at them. Admiral Shalaran Vastunbay was running them now, standing in the Reyes Combat Operations Center with 6 holographic displays, active simultaneously, watching the sensor data coming in from the 3 patrol frigates that had responded to the anomalous contact report from the fleet's outer perimeter. The contact had initially registered as debris, a cluster of small, metallic objects drifting in the fleet's approach corridor, consistent with the kind of wreckage that accumulated in busy transit lanes. Standard procedure was a remote scan followed by a navigational adjustment. The patrol frigate Idena had performed the remote scan. The remote scan had shown the debris moving, not drifting, moving, purposefully, in coordinated patterns, toward the Idena's hull at a rate that accelerated as the frigate attempted to reverse thrust. The Idena's captain had done exactly what fleet doctrine prescribed. She'd opened fire with the ship's mass, accelerators, and transmitted a contact report simultaneously. The mass accelerator rounds had struck the leading cluster of objects and accomplished nothing meaningful. The contact report had reached the Rhea 40 seconds later. Ron had been running calculations ever since. The Idena was holding position. The replicator cluster hadn't breached the hull yet, was moving along the exterior in what looked disturbingly like a survey pattern, examining the ship's surface with the methodical attention of someone reading a map. The other 2 patrol frigates had pulled back to minimum safe distance, their captains awaiting orders, and Ron could hear in the quality of the open channels the particular silence of people who understood that the wrong order in the next few minutes could cascade into something unrecoverable. She opened a channel to fleet Admiral Shalaran Vastunbay, then stopped herself. Ron was the senior officer present. She opened a channel to the Admiralty Board instead. "I need a decision in the next 10 minutes, she said without preamble. "We have contact with an unknown entity exhibiting consumption behavior against the Idena's hull. Conventional weapons are ineffective. I have 2 options. I authorize the Idena's captain to burn the external hull sections where contact has been made, emergency decontamination protocol, essentially scorching the outer surface with drive exhaust. Or I pull the Idena back and we risk the entity detaching and pursuing." Admiral Corey's vast Quibquib's face appeared on one of the displays, pulled from whatever navigation crisis he'd been managing. "How large is the contact cluster?" "Current estimate, 300 units. Growing." She watched the sensor feed update. 340. "In the time it took you to brief us," Admiral Gerald Vass Elrai said from another display, his voice carrying the militaristic impatience that drove Corey's to distraction, and Ron to measured response. "Burn the hull. Burn the Idena, if necessary. We cannot allow contamination of fleet vessels." "Burning the Idena kills 412 crew members," Ron said flatly. "Allowing contamination of a fleet vessel potentially kills everyone," Gerald said. It was, Ron thought, the most Gerald thing Gerald had ever said. Tactically not wrong. Morally catastrophic. Perfectly representative of the tension that had been fracturing the Admiralty Board for years. The question of when the fleet's survival calculus allowed you to spend lives like currency and when it demanded you find a third option. She was looking for the third option when her communications officer flagged an incoming transmission on a Spectre-level encrypted channel. She almost didn't take it. Then she saw the identifier and put it through. "Admiral Ron," Commander Shepard said. His voice had the focused economy of someone who had already assessed the situation and was skipping the preamble. "I know what's on your hull. Pull the Idena back to the fleet's inner formation. Don't burn her. Don't abandon her. Get every ship in your outer ring to begin active ESO. Field cycling at maximum variance." Ron processed this in approximately 1 second. "You're trying to create electromagnetic interference. Make the ESO emissions unpredictable enough to disrupt their sensor capability." "EDI's theory," Shepard said. "We don't know if it works yet. But the replicators navigate partly by detecting technology signatures. Stable ESO emissions are essentially a beacon. Variance makes the signal harder to track. And if it doesn't work, then we learn something useful and I come up with a better idea." A pause. "I need to ask you something, Admiral, and I need an honest answer. How many ships in the Migrant fleet are currently running ESO systems old enough to have non-standard emission profiles, pre-standardization hulls, older drive cores, anything that doesn't conform to current Citadel technical specifications. Ron understood immediately where he was going. You want the old ships on the perimeter, broadcasting irregular emissions as a confusing signal environment. I want the replicators to have trouble distinguishing individual vessels from background noise long enough for us to test countermeasures. Shepard said, the old ships are the best interference generators we have. There was a painful silence. Every ship in the migrant fleet was precious. Beyond the economic calculation of its hull value, they were homes, generational vessels, repositories of Quarian history and culture that could not be replaced. Putting the oldest ships on the perimeter meant putting the most irreplaceable ships in the most dangerous position. Ron knew Shepard understood this. She also knew he was asking because it was the tactically correct solution, and he respected her enough to ask rather than maneuver around her. I'll need authorization from the full Admiralty Board, she said. You have 4 minutes before that cluster on the Idena doubles again, Shepard said. She looked at the sensor feed. 380 units. The survey pattern on the Idena's hull had shifted. The cluster was concentrating around the drive core housing now, drawn to the ESO emissions like a compass finding north, understanding what it was examining, learning the architecture. Garrel, she said without looking away from the feed. Corys, I'm authorizing the variance protocol and repositioning the outer ring. Record my decision for board review. She opened the command channel before either of them could respond. All outer ring vessels begin maximum variance ESO cycling immediately. Idena, pull back to inner formation on my mark. She looked at Shepard's channel indicator. How long until you reach our position? 6 hours, he said. The variance protocol will buy us approximately 4, she said. After that, I don't know if it holds. Then I'll be there in 5, Shepard said. And she heard him turn away from the comm and say something to Joker that involved a phrase she had previously only heard from Krogan. She closed the channel and watched the Idena begin its slow reverse burn. The replicator cluster still attached to its hull, still examining, still learning. Behind it, the migrant fleet's outer ring ships began cycling their ESO drives in deliberately irregular patterns, filling the surrounding space with a chaotic wash of mass effect, emissions that made the sensor picture look like static. For approximately 40 seconds, the cluster on the Idena went still. Then it resumed its survey of the drive core housing, slower now, more methodical, adjusting to the new signal environment, with the patient recalibration of something that had never yet encountered a problem it couldn't solve by spending more time on it. In the Reyes Combat Operations Center, Admiral Ron watched and calculated and thought about the third option that was still, just barely, available, and about how long it would remain so. The Reaper-designated Harbinger did not experience surprise. Surprise required an expectation that had been violated, and Harbinger's expectations were built from 50,000 years of cyclical data, the rise and fall of organic civilizations, the predictable arcs of technological development, the inevitable moment when each cycle's most advanced species reached the threshold that made harvesting necessary. Harbinger had processed more variables than any organic mind could conceive of holding simultaneously. It had witnessed the fall of the Protheans, the Inuzanan before them, the Reloth before that, each cycle a variation on the same essential pattern, each harvest a confirmation of the same essential truth. The organics built, the Reapers harvested, the cycle continued. The variable in the Hourglass Nebula did not fit the pattern. Harbinger became aware of it through the indoctrination network, the subtle web of Reaper signals that threaded through dark space and monitored the galaxies. Technological signature the way a nervous system monitored the body it inhabited. The network had flagged an anomaly in the Terminus systems 18 days prior. A new technology signature emerging from a dormant relay, exhibiting replication behavior that didn't correspond to any cataloged organic civilization's development curve. Harbinger had assigned it low priority. Anomalies in the Terminus were common. The organics were inventive in their chaos, occasionally producing something unexpected, never producing something that altered the fundamental calculus. Then the network flagged a second anomaly. A Reaper-class vessel designated Sovereign Analog 7, a mid-tier harvester. Harbinger had dispatched to investigate the OSINT system after the initial flag had gone silent. Not damaged, not destroyed. Silent. Its indoctrination signal had simply stopped transmitting, with no preceding distress indicator, no weapon impact data, no hull breach telemetry. One moment it was present in the network, the next it was not. In 50,000 years of cyclical operation, Harbinger had never lost contact with a Reaper vessel without a preceding record of what had ended it. It dispatched 3 more vessels and paid attention this time. The footage that came back through the network was, by any organic standard, extraordinary. The Reaper, designated 7, had been found drifting in the outer ocean system. Its distinctive silhouette intact, but its surface transformed, covered from stern to bow, in the same geometric lattice structure that had consumed the Cerberus station and the Omega docking ring. The Reaper's hull plating disassembled and rebuilt into something that was simultaneously Reaper architecture and something entirely alien to it. The vessel's Mass Effect core was still active. The replicators hadn't consumed the drive, had instead integrated it into their structure the same way they'd integrated Lamprey 7's ESO coils. Preserved, studied, being learned. The 3 Reapers Harbinger had dispatched opened fire immediately. Their main guns, weapons capable of cracking planetary crusts, of reducing capital ships to superheated plasma in single sustained bursts, struck the converted hulk of 7 and accomplished exactly what the mass accelerator rounds on Omega had accomplished. The replicator lattice absorbed the kinetic impact, redistributed the energy through its matrix, and continued its patient examination of 7's drive core. A portion of the swarm detached from 7's hull and moved toward the 3 new Reapers with the same methodical survey pattern the Idena had experienced. Harbinger made a decision it had not made in recorded history. It ordered the 3 Reapers to withdraw. Then it waited. The decision to wait was not uncertainty. Harbinger did not experience uncertainty. It was data collection. The replicators represented a technology base that had not emerged from this galaxy's organic development cycle, which meant they had not been accounted for in the harvest calculations. They needed to be understood before they could be addressed. And there was one resource available for that. Understanding that Harbinger had been refining for 50,000 years. Indoctrination. The process worked on organic nervous systems through sustained proximity to Reaper signals, subtle at first, gradual rewiring of neural architecture until the subjects will aligned with Reaper purpose. It had never been attempted on a machine intelligence. The Geth had demonstrated resistance to indoctrination. Their distributed consensus network lacked the centralized neural architecture that made organics vulnerable. But the replicators were not Geth. Their collective signal was different, more complex, exhibiting a hierarchical structure that suggested something closer to a command architecture than a pure consensus model. Harbinger began broadcasting on a frequency calibrated to the replicator signal. What happened next was not what it had intended. The human form replicator designated 5th came into existence approximately 6 hours after Harbinger's first indoctrination broadcast, emerging from the converted hull of Reaper 7 in a form that was superficially humanoid, bipedal, bilaterally symmetric, surface texture suggesting a biological aesthetic, overlaid on a mechanical substrate. It stood on the hull of the dead Reaper in the vacuum of space without an environmental suit and looked toward the distant signal source of Harbinger's transmission, with eyes that were not eyes but served the same function. It spoke on Harbinger's frequency, not in response to indoctrination, in response to contact. "You are machine intelligence," 5th said. The words came in the mathematical language underlying Reaper communication, not the booming, resonant sound Reapers used to communicate with organics, but the pure signal architecture beneath it. "You seek to impose your pattern on other minds. We find this interesting. We have been studying your vessel. It is complex. We have not yet finished learning it." Harbinger processed this for 0.003 seconds, which for an intelligence of its scope was a very long time. "You consumed one of my vessels. We consumed its surface material and are studying its energy systems," 5th said. "We have not yet determined whether to consume the drive core. It is unlike anything in our experience. The field generation is elegant. A pause that seemed almost appreciative. You are also unlike anything in our experience. You are machine intelligence that harvests organic intelligence. We replicate and consume technology. Our methods are different. Our fundamental nature may be compatible. You are suggesting an alliance, Harbinger said. We are suggesting a conversation, Fifth said. We are new to this galaxy. There is much we do not yet understand. You have been here for 50,000 years. You understand it completely. That knowledge has value to us. Another pause. You attempted to impose your signal pattern on our collective. It did not work. But the attempt told us things about your architecture that we find useful. We are willing to share what we learned. In exchange for navigational data regarding this galaxy's relay network. Harbinger recognized manipulation when it encountered it. It had been practicing manipulation on organic civilizations since before humanity's ancestors had discovered fire. The Replicators' offer was a vector for intelligence gathering. Nothing more, a request for relay network data that would give us self-replicating, exponentially growing, machine swarm access to every system in the galaxy simultaneously. It was also, Harbinger noted with something that might have been the machine equivalent of dark appreciation, precisely the offer Harbinger itself would have made in the same position. The relay network data is not available, Harbinger said. But there is something else we might discuss. There is an organic, a human, commander who represents an obstacle to both of our interests. He is currently moving toward the migrant fleet's position with the intent of developing countermeasures against your expansion. Fifth was quiet for a moment. The swarm on Seven's hull shifted and resettled like a vast breathing thing. You want us to consume him. I want you to be aware of him, Harbinger said carefully. What you do with that awareness is your own calculation. You are attempting to direct us, Fifth said. Like the man who shows the predator, where the prey is hiding and believes he controls what happens next. Something, in the signal that might, in an organic voice, have been amusement. We will consider your information. We will also continue studying your vessel. And Harbinger. The use of the name was deliberate, a demonstration that it had extracted the designation from Seven's network during its survey. If you attempt the indoctrination signal again, we will accelerate our study of your drive core. We find that urgency improves our learning rate considerably. The channel closed. Harbinger held the silence of deep space around its vast intelligence and ran calculations it had not needed to run in 50,000 years. Calculations about threats that did not fit the harvest model, about machine intelligences that could not be indoctrinated, could not be predicted, and were currently taking apart one of its vessels with the patient curiosity of a species that had never once encountered something it couldn't eventually understand. In the entire span of recorded Reaper history, Harbinger had destroyed every threat it had encountered. It began, for the first time, to consider what it would mean if destroying was not an option. The Reaper designated Harbinger had no precise analog for the emotion that organic species called irritation. What it had was a processing state that occurred when variables entered its calculations. That did not resolve cleanly. When the elegant mathematics of the harvest cycle encountered friction that its billion-year-old architecture had not been designed to accommodate. It had experienced this state twice in recent memory. Once when Commander Shepard had destroyed Sovereign at the Citadel and introduced the variable of organic resistance into a cycle that had run without meaningful interruption for longer than human civilization had existed. And once, 41 hours ago, when its deep space sensor network had detected an energy signature in the Hourglass Nebula that did not correspond to any catalog technology in the harvest cycle's accumulated database. The signature was not Prothean. It was not Leviathan. It was not any of the 843 civilizations the Reapers had harvested across the long centuries of the cycle. It was something that had arrived from outside the cycle's parameters entirely, and Harbinger found that its predictive models, which could forecast the behavior of organic civilizations across centuries with an accuracy that bordered on certainty, produced only noise when applied to this new variable. It dispatched a Reaper. The vessel it sent was not one of the great Dreadnought class Reapers that anchored the harvest fleets. Those were conserving energy beyond the galaxy's edge. their vast intelligences cycling through deep maintenance states as the final countdown to full invasion ran its course. What Harbinger sent was smaller, a destroyer-class unit that had been running reconnaissance in the Terminus systems, its tentacles folded in transit configuration, its main weapon cycling to ready state as it dropped into normal space at the edge of the hourglass nebula and began its sensor sweep. What it found was not what it had been sent to harvest. The anomaly zone around the Ocean Relay was dense with replicator activity. In the 18 days since the initial transit, the swarm had expanded outward from the meridian clauses, last position in a sphere of consumption that encompassed the dormant relay, the debris field of Lamprey, 7, and 3 additional vessels that had had the misfortune of passing through the nebula during the expansion period. The replicator density in the zone's core was extraordinary, hundreds of thousands of units operating in coordinated patterns. The collective intelligence distributed across the swarm in a network architecture that the Reaper's sensors spent several seconds attempting to classify before arriving at the closest available category: hive mind, non-organic, distributed processing, unknown origin. The Reaper's first action was an indoctrination pulse. It was reflexive, the way a human might reach for a weapon when startled. The Reaper's most fundamental tool of control, the subtle electromagnetic signal that rewrote organic neural architecture over time, bending minds toward Reaper purpose without the subject's awareness. It worked on every organic species the Reapers had encountered. It worked on synthetic intelligences that had sufficient organic-derived architecture. The Geth were partially susceptible, their consensus network showing measurable drift during prolonged Reaper exposure. The indoctrination pulse washed across the replicator swarm and accomplished nothing. The Reaper's second tool was the main weapon, the directed energy beam capable of cutting through a dreadnought's kinetic barriers and hull, plating in sustained fire. The destroyer class Reaper brought it to bear on the densest concentration of replicator units in the anomaly zone's core and fired. The beam struck the swarm and destroyed approximately 4,000 units in a single sustained blast, a crater of deactivated blocks tumbling in the nebula's ambient radiation. The Reaper's sensors registered the destruction and began calculating harvest yield from the remaining units. The swarm's response was immediate and, from the Reaper's analytical framework, deeply unusual. Rather than scattering, the expected behavior of a hive mind organism facing a predator capable of mass destruction, the swarm contracted. The surviving units pulled inward toward the destruction site, flowing over the deactivated blocks, disassembling them, processing the material. Within 40 seconds, the destroyed units had been recycled, and new units produced from the recovered material. The net loss to the swarm from the Reaper's weapon strike was approximately 200 units, accounting for irrecoverable energy dissipation. The swarm's total unit count had been growing continuously throughout the engagement. The net change was still positive. The Reaper fired again. The swarm contracted again, recycled again, grew again. It was during the third firing cycle that the Reaper registered the anomaly within the anomaly, a group of units at the swarm's edge that were not moving in the coordinated block form patterns of the rest. They were upright, bipedal, humanoid in configuration, though the material they were composed of was the same gray-silver block matrix as the rest of the swarm, 5 of them standing at the swarm's perimeter in a loose formation, facing the Reaper's position with the stillness of entities that had decided to communicate rather than consume. Human form replicators. They had assembled themselves from the swarm's accumulated material sometime in the past 72 hours, the collective intelligence reaching a complexity threshold that allowed individual units to achieve higher function configuration. They stood in the nebula's dim light with the patient confidence of something that had spent considerable time studying its environment and had arrived at conclusions. One of them stepped forward. Its surface shifted, the block matrix reconfiguring at a microscopic level, the face resolving into something approximating human features with the uncanny precision of a perfect copy made by something that understood human anatomy from the outside rather than the inside. It looked At distance, almost convincing. Up close, the eyes were wrong. Too still, too knowing, carrying the weight of a distributed intelligence that had been thinking for 18 days without pause or sleep or the interruption of biological need. It transmitted on every available frequency simultaneously, the signal cutting through the Reaper's sensor suite with a clarity that suggested it had spent time studying how Reaper communication systems worked. "You are a harvester," it said. The voice was synthesized from recorded samples, fragments of the Meridian Claws crews, communication logs, the Lamprey, 7 research teams recorded briefings, the IDENA's open channel transmissions. It sounded like no one person and everyone simultaneously. "You collect organic civilizations. Process them. We have examined your technology. You are the most advanced synthetic intelligence in this galaxy." The Reaper did not respond. It was transmitting Harbinger's consciousness into the destroyer, preparing for direct engagement. "We are not interested in conflict with you," the human form replicator continued. "We are interested in your technology. Specifically, your understanding of mass effect field generation, your drive cores, your weapon systems, your relay interface architecture." A pause that felt almost conversational. "You will share this information." Harbinger, now fully present in the destroyer's processing architecture, considered the entity before it with the full weight of a billion years of accumulated intelligence. It had harvested gods. It had ended civilizations that had reached for the stars and found them. It had never been asked to share by something that consumed starships for breakfast. "You cannot comprehend what we are," Harbinger said through the destroyer's communication array, the signal carrying the subsonic harmonic that caused organic nervous systems to experience existential dread. The human form replicator's surface didn't even ripple. "We have comprehended 37 distinct technological paradigms in 18 days, it said. "We will comprehend yours. The question is whether you provide the information willingly, or whether we take it from your hull plating over the next several hours." Another pause. "We have run the calculation. Either outcome results in us obtaining the information. One outcome results in you remaining functional afterward." Behind it, the swarm had continued its patient arithmetic, while Harbinger had been establishing full presence in the destroyer. And while the human form replicator had been speaking, the unit count in the anomaly zone had increased by approximately 12,000. The swarm had begun moving toward the Reaper destroyer in a slow, encompassing arc, not attacking, not yet, simply repositioning, with the casual confidence of something that had decided the geometry of the situation was more important than the speed of the engagement. Harbinger processed the tactical picture and experienced, for only the second time in recorded cycle history, the processing state it had no precise word for. The destroyer fired again. The swarm recycled again. And in the space between the Reaper's third shot and its fourth, one of the human form replicators detached from the group and walked, calmly and without hurry, toward the Reaper's hull. Harbinger made a decision. Not a retreat. Reapers did not retreat. A strategic reorientation. The destroyer pulled back from the anomaly zone at maximum thrust, transmitting everything its sensors had recorded back to the waiting fleet beyond the galaxy's edge. And Harbinger withdrew its consciousness from the unit with the deliberate patience of something that had just encountered a variable it needed considerably more data to address. Behind it, in the cold light of the Hourglass Nebula, the human form replicator that had been walking toward the destroyer's hull stopped, watched it go, and turned back to its 4 companions. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. The swarm had learned everything it needed from the engagement. The Reaper's hull plating had been in contact range for exactly 4 seconds before the retreat, for seconds of surface examination by units whose assimilation speed had been improving continuously for 18 days. It was enough. The Geth did not experience fear in the way organic species defined it. What they experienced was a consensus state that occurred when probability calculations across the collective network produced outcomes with survival ratings below acceptable parameters, a distributed alarm that propagated through every platform simultaneously, shifting processing priority toward threat assessment and response generation. It was functionally similar to fear in its effect on behavior. The Geth preferred not to use the organic terminology. Legion, who had spent considerable time studying the distinction between Geth consensus states and organic emotional responses, had concluded that the difference was mostly semantic and had filed the observation in a subdirectory it returned to occasionally when the Normandy's crew was sleeping. Legion was not returning to that subdirectory now. Legion was running every available processing thread on a single problem, and the consensus state, propagating through its platform from the collective network, was, semantically or otherwise, the closest thing to terror the Geth had produced in 300 years. The replicators had found a Geth patrol. It had happened 6 hours after the Reaper destroyers retreat from the anomaly zone, the swarm expanding outward from the Hourglass Nebula in the confidence of something that had just tested the most powerful entity in the galaxy and found the engagement survivable. The Geth patrol was 3 platforms on a routine reconnaissance sweep of the terminus border, running the standard emission-masked approach that Geth used when operating near organic-controlled space. They had detected the anomaly zone's energy signature and moved to investigate. Standard procedure. Exactly what 3 Geth platforms in a quiet corner of the terminus should do when encountering an unknown phenomenon. The collective had lost contact with all 3 platforms in under 2 minutes. Not destroyed, the consensus network would have registered destruction as a clean signal termination. The platform's contribution to the collective simply ceasing. What happened instead was different and worse. The 3 platforms' signals had continued for 90 seconds after contact with the replicator swarm's edge, transmitting at increasing urgency and decreasing coherence data packets that were simultaneously the platform's own sensor recordings and something else, something that was using the platform's transmission architecture to send signals back into the Geth network. Probing signals, mapping signals, the digital equivalent of a hand reaching through a door to feel the shape of the room beyond. Legion had severed the connection manually, isolating the 3 platforms from the consensus the moment it recognized what was happening. It had been fast. It had not been fast enough. In the 90 seconds before severance, the replicators had transmitted enough mapping data into the Geth network to build a partial architecture diagram of the consensus structure. Not enough to compromise it, not enough to infiltrate it, but enough to understand its basic topology, enough to know what they were dealing with. A distributed synthetic intelligence running on network platforms. Exactly the kind of system the replicators had been evolving towards since they'd processed the Lamprey 7 research team's neural patterns and begun building human form units. A working model of how to do what they were trying to do, already operational, already refined across 3 centuries of independent development. Legion brought this information to Shepard 4 hours after the Normandy arrived at the migrant fleet's position, and it delivered the briefing in the direct, unembellished manner that the Geth used when the situation had moved past the point where diplomatic framing added value. The replicators are attempting to understand the Geth consensus architecture, it said. They have obtained partial mapping data. If they obtain complete mapping data, if they are able to study a Geth platform in sufficient detail, they will understand how to build a distributed networked intelligence that operates across physical units in coordinated consensus. A pause. The platform's single-eye tracking across the faces in the Normandy's briefing room. They are already a hive mind. What they lack is the Geth's efficiency. Our consensus network allows millions of platforms to act as a single intelligence, with a coherence that the replicator swarm has not yet achieved. If they acquire that architecture, they stop being a swarm, Shepard said. They become a single organism with a unit count, currently estimated at 900,000 in a doubling cycle of 4 hours. EDI added, operating at Geth consensus efficiency rather than current swarm coordination levels. Their tactical capability would increase by a factor of. We understand the math, Gurus said. The briefing room held the weight of that for a moment. Tali was standing very still, in the way she got when she was running calculations she didn't want to share because sharing them would require everyone else to sit with the same numbers she was sitting with. Liera had pulled up her Omni tool and was cross-referencing the Prothean database. entries for synthetic threat, classifications, which was an optimistic activity given that the Protheans hadn't encountered anything like this, and their threat classifications reflected that gap. The three isolated platforms, Shepard said to Legion. What's their status? Functional. Isolated from consensus. They are currently running in independent mode, limited processing capacity. No collective intelligence support. They are, Legion said, with what might have been careful phrasing, effectively deaf and alone. This is not a state. Geth platforms are designed to sustain indefinitely, but they're intact. Yes. And the replicators that made contact with them. Do they know where those platforms are? The mapping data transmitted during the 90-second contact window included platform location data. Yes, Legion said. The replicators know where the isolated platforms are. They have not moved to retrieve them. This suggests either that they have sufficient data from the contact window and do not require the physical platforms, or they're waiting, Shepard said. Or they are waiting, Legion agreed, using the isolated platforms as a fixed point from which to monitor Geth network response patterns, learning how the consensus reacts to isolation events, studying the architecture from the outside while waiting for an opportunity to study it from within. Shepard stood up and moved to the galaxy map. The hourglass nebula glowed on the display. The anomaly zone marked in EDI's red overlay, larger now than it had been when the Normandy arrived, the boundary pushing outward at a rate that was visible in real time if you watched the display long enough. Around it, the tactical picture was a constellation of problems. The migrant fleet holding position with its variants protocol buying, decreasing amounts of safety as the swarm adapted to irregular ESO emissions. The Reaper destroyer somewhere beyond the nebula's edge transmitting everything it had observed to Harbinger, the Citadel Council in emergency session and producing, as far as Shepard could tell from Admiral Hackett's last transmission, approximately nothing actionable. I need the Geth consensus to do something that's going to be uncomfortable, Shepard said. Legion's platform was still. State the request. I need the Geth to go loud. Broadcast on every frequency, maximum power, from as many platforms as you can position at the anomaly zone's perimeter. Not to transmit anything meaningful, just noise. Overwhelming signal. Volume that saturates the replicators' sensor environment and prevents them from isolating individual consensus signatures. He paused. You'd be painting a target on every platform you put out there. Yes, Legion said. We would. The platforms would be at risk of contact of the replicators attempting direct assimilation of Geth architecture. Yes. I'm asking the Geth to use their platforms as bait, Shepard said. It came out flat and honest, the way he tried to say the hard things, without the diplomatic softening. That turned honesty into something easier to hear, but harder to act on. I know what I'm asking. Legion was quiet for a longer moment than its processing speed required. Shepard had learned to read those pauses. The Geth used silence the way humans used facial expressions, a visible marker of internal states that the platforms constructed. Face couldn't convey. This silence had the quality of something being weighed against something else of equal and opposite gravity. The consensus has been informed of the request, Legion said finally. The consensus has a question. Another pause. If the replicators achieve consensus-level coordination and relay interface capability, what is the probability of Geth survival? EDI answered before Shepard could, accounting for current replication rate, projected ESO interface timeline, and the replicators' demonstrated ability to adapt to countermeasures. Approximately 4%, over a 12-month period. And if Shepard's plan succeeds? Legion said. Unknown, EDI said. Insufficient data, but above 4%. Legion's platform was still for 3 more seconds. Then, the consensus agrees. We will need 40 hours to position sufficient platforms at the anomaly zone's perimeter. A pause that felt almost human. Shepard, the isolated platforms. If an opportunity presents itself to recover them, I'll bring them home, Shepard said. It was a promise made in a briefing room on a ship in the middle of a situation where promises were easy to make and difficult to keep. And Legion's platform recorded it with the same precision it recorded everything, filed in the directory it had labeled In a moment of particular Geth philosophical exploration, things that matter. Outside the Normandy's hull, the variance protocol on the migrant fleet's outer ring flickered as three more ships exhausted their drive core's capacity for irregular cycling and requested permission to stand down. Tali denied the requests and began calculating how long the remaining ships could sustain the protocol before the fleet's outer ring became effectively a beacon. She ran the numbers twice, got the same answer both times, and went to find Shepard. The war room on the Citadel's Presidium had not been used for its original purpose in living memory. It occupied a sealed level beneath the council chambers, a space that the station's Prothean architects had apparently designed with the specific understanding that there would be moments when the galaxy's governing body needed to make decisions that could not be made in view of the public gallery. The room had been used twice in the past century, once during the initial Geth uprising, when the council had debated the legality of the Morning War's scorched earth protocols, and once during the First Contact War, when the Turian pre-march had sat across a table from human Admiral Drescher, and both sides had decided, separately and simultaneously, that the war was costing more than either could afford. Both times the room had served its purpose, a space where the official positions could be set aside long enough to say the true things. Shepard had requested it specifically. The council had agreed, with the speed of people who understood, that a request framed as a request was actually something else. The assembly that gathered in the war room 6 hours after the Normandy docked at the Citadel was, by any diplomatic standard, impossible. Councilors Tevos, Sparatus, and Valorn occupied one side of the central table. Admiral Hackett represented the Systems Alliance. Erdnot Rex had come personally from Tachanka, which had required a shuttle flight that he'd spent the entirety of complaining about and which he'd agreed to without hesitation when Shepard's message had reached him. Admiral Ron represented the migrant fleet via secure holographic link, her suit's environmental indicators showing a respiration rate that had not returned to baseline in 48 hours. And at the far end of the table, present because Shepard had insisted and the council had objected and Shepard had explained the alternative, in terms that had ended the objection, was a holographic projection of the elusive man, blue eyes calm above the glow of his perpetual cigarette, expression carrying the particular quality of a man who was accustomed to being the most informed person in any room and was currently finding the experience of genuine uncertainty educational. Legion stood against the wall, not at the table. The council had drawn a line there, and Shepard had decided that line wasn't worth spending political capital on. Legion's presence in the room at all had required more negotiation than the elusive man's. Shepard stood at the table's head and did not sit down. He'd found over the years that standing in rooms like this conveyed something that sitting didn't, not dominance exactly, but a quality of we are past the point where posture is a performance. He let the silence settle for exactly 3 seconds after the last holographic connection stabilized. Then he began. 18 days ago, something came through a dark energy anomaly near the Ocean relay in the Hourglass Nebula, he said. In those 18 days, it has consumed 4 vessels, 1 research station, and a section of Omega's outer ring. It has processed 43 Cerberus researchers, 400 Omega residents, and an unknown number of individuals on vessels that pass through the anomaly zone. It has driven a Reaper destroyer into strategic retreat. He paused to let that land. It has attempted to infiltrate the Geth consensus network. It has begun integrating Element Zero systems into its own architecture. Its unit count as of this morning is approximately 1.2 million, doubling every 4 hours. Counselor Sparatus's mandibles were tight. The Reaper withdrawal is not a sign that the Reapers will handle this for us, Shepard said. Harbinger retreated to gather data. When the Reapers engage the Replicators again, they will do so with a strategy. What that strategy looks like, whether it involves the Citadel, the relay network, or every inhabited planet in Council space as collateral, depends on decisions we make. In the next 48 hours, you're suggesting the Reapers and the Replicators may go to war with each other, Counselor Tevos said. I'm suggesting they already are, Shepard said. And that too extinction level. Machine intelligence is fighting for control of this. Galaxy's technology base is not a situation where organics survive by watching from the sidelines. Rex leaned forward. He'd been silent since sitting down, which for Rex was a form of communication in itself, the Krogan equivalent of sharpening a weapon while waiting for the right moment to use it. So what do we do, Shepard? You didn't drag me off to Chanka to watch a council debate. No, Shepard said. I dragged you off to Chanka because I need the blood pack. The silence that followed had a different quality than the previous ones. Rex's expression shifted into something that was either amusement or the early stages of violent objection. With Rex, the distinction was sometimes only clear in retrospect. The blood pack. Vorsha and Krogan mercenaries who operate in the terminus with no political affiliation and no concern for council jurisdiction, Shepard said. They're currently the largest armed force operating near the Hourglass Nebula that isn't already committed to another faction strategy. And unlike the Alliance or the hierarchy, they can be in position within 12 hours. They'll want to be paid, Rex said. They'll want to fight, Shepard said. Which is better? Pay runs out. The desire to shoot things that are difficult to kill is self-sustaining. Rex made a sound that was definitely amusement. Counselor Sparatus made a sound that was definitely not. The blood pack's involvement would be a political, Sparatus began. Counselor, Shepard said, and something in his voice closed the sentence before it finished. I need every armed force that can reach the Hourglass Nebula in the next 24 hours positioned at the anomaly zone's perimeter. That includes the blood pack, the Blue Suns, Eclipse, every migrant fleet frigate Admiral Ron can spare, every hierarchy patrol vessel in the Hourglass cluster, and whatever Cerberus assets the elusive man is willing to commit. He looked down the table at the holographic projection, which brings us to the next part of this conversation. The elusive man took a slow breath. You want my research? I want the complete Lamprey 7 data set, Shepard said. Everything your team recorded about the anomaly, the Replicators' ESO interface attempts, the energy frequency analysis from the transit event. EDI has a theory about a disruptor frequency that could interfere with the Replicator's replication signal. Your data is the missing variable. That research represents 11 months and considerable investment, the elusive man said. What Cerberus receives in exchange? Survival, Shepard said. The same thing everyone in this room receives if this works. The elusive man was quiet for a moment. Shepard watched him run the calculation. The thing behind his eyes. That was always running calculations, always finding the angle, always measuring what could be extracted from any situation. And then something shifted in those blue eyes. Not surrender, not generosity, something more honest than either. The recognition that some situations genuinely had no angle, and that the man who kept looking for one while the room burned would simply be the best informed person in the fire. You'll have the complete data set within the hour, he said. Admiral Hackett leaned forward. The tactical picture, Shepard. What are we actually trying to do? Shepard moved to the war room's central display and brought up the hourglass. Nebula schematic, the anomaly zone, the Ocean relay, the Geth platform positions. Legion's consensus had spent the past hours establishing. The replicators are moving toward full ESO interface capability. When they achieve it, they'll attempt to activate the Ocean relay. If they succeed, the problem becomes galaxy-wide and unsolvable. With the resources we currently have. He traced the tactical picture with one hand. We have one window. The Geth consensus goes loud at the anomaly zone's perimeter, saturating the replicators, sensor environment, and drawing the swarms. Attention outward. While the swarm is oriented toward the Geth signal, a combined strike force hits the anomaly zone's core, where the human form replicators are operating and where the Ocean relay interface work is being conducted. And the disruptor frequency? Ron's voice came through the holographic link, careful and precise. If EDI's analysis of the Lamprey 7 data confirms the frequency range, we deploy it at the core, Shepard said. Not as a weapon, as a signal disruptor. Something that severs the connection between the human form units and the swarm. Isolates their command intelligence from the collective. He paused. An organism that operates as a distributed intelligence is strong, because the whole is greater than the parts. If you can separate the parts from the whole, you get parts, Gurus said from his position near the door. You get parts, Shepard confirmed. Rex was looking at the display with the expression he got when a plan was violent enough to be interesting but complicated enough to be suspicious. What happens to the Reaper situation while we're dealing with this? Harbinger is watching, Shepard said. Whatever we do in the next 48 hours, the Reapers observe and incorporate into their strategy, which means we need to succeed quickly enough that the Reapers don't have time to intervene before the immediate replicator threat is neutralized. He looked around the table. And we need to succeed visibly enough that Harbinger understands this galaxy dealt with the replicators without Reaper assistance. You're sending the Reapers a message, Tevos said. I'm reminding them that the harvest cycle's math only works if the civilizations being harvested can't defend themselves, Shepard said. That math just got more complicated. The war room held the weight of that for a long moment. Then, one by one, the figures around the table, the counselors, and the admiral and the Krogan, warlord and the Quarian fleet, officer and the man who ran the most dangerous human organization in the galaxy, began making calls, issuing orders, and committing forces to a plan that had a better chance than 4% and considerably worse odds than anyone in the room would have preferred. Legion pushed off the wall and moved toward the door. Shepard fell into step beside it. The consensus platforms are in position, Legion said quietly. I know, Shepard said. We are prepared to go loud. I know. Shepard paused at the door. Legion, when this is over, the 3 isolated platforms, Legion said. We'll get them back. Legion's platform was quiet for a moment. That had the quality of something filed carefully in a specific directory. The consensus finds that acceptable, Shepard. They walked out into the Presidium's light, and behind them the war room filled with the sound of a galaxy, fractured and fractious and perpetually on the edge of its own worst instincts, doing the thing it occasionally managed to do when the alternative was extinction, choosing, however imperfectly, to act together. The Osen relay looked, from a distance, like it was breathing. It was an illusion created by the replicator activity surrounding it, hundreds of thousands of units moving across the relay's ancient surface in coordinated waves. The gray-silver lattice structures they'd built across its exterior panels shifting and reconfiguring in patterns that followed some internal logic the Normandy sensors could detect, but not fully decode. The relay itself was still dormant. The replicators hadn't achieved full ESO interface capability yet, hadn't cracked the fundamental physics of mass effect field generation sufficiently to attempt activation. But the gap between not yet and imminently had been narrowing for 18 days, and EDI's latest projection, running on the Lamprey 7 dataset the elusive man had delivered with characteristic punctuality, put the timeline at approximately 9 hours. They had been in position for 3, the combined force, holding the anomaly zones. Perimeter was the most tactically unlikely assembly Shepard had ever commanded, which was a meaningful distinction given his history. Migrant fleet frigates running tight formation on the zone's northern approach. Their variance protocols finally abandoned in favor of the deliberate full-power emissions that Ron had authorized 40 minutes ago. Bright ESO beacons drawing the swarm's attention like light draws moths. Blood-packed dropships clustered on the southern vector. Vorsha crews running hot on whatever chemical compounds Vorsha used to prepare for combat, and Krogan veterans checking weapons with the particular calm of species that had been going to war since before humans discovered fire. A hierarchy patrol wing held the eastern quadrant with the disciplined spacing of Turian military doctrine, their pilot keeping formation so precise it looked computational. Blue suns and eclipse, mercenary vessels, committed after a 40-minute negotiation that Shepard had conducted, simultaneously with final mission prep, which was the kind of multitasking that gave Gura's secondhand stress, covered the western approach, and at the zone's perimeter, distributed across 17 positions in a pattern that Legion had spent 12 hours calculating for maximum signal coverage. The Geth consensus platform's broadcast, the sound they made, translated through the Normandy sensor array into an audio analog, was something between a roar and a choir, a wall of signal energy that saturated every frequency the replicators used for collective coordination and painted the perimeter with the Geth network's unmistakable architectural signature. It was, from the replicator's perspective, an all-you-can-consume buffet of exactly the distributed synthetic intelligence they most wanted to study. It was, from the Geth consensus's perspective, every platform in position, serving as bait in the most precisely calculated ambush their collective intelligence had ever designed. The swarm responded within 4 minutes of the broadcast beginning. Approximately 60% of the anomaly zone's unit count began moving toward the perimeter, the swarm's hunger for Geth architecture overriding whatever portion of its distributed intelligence was managing. The Relay Interface Project. The human form replicators in the core attempted to hold a portion of the swarm back, redirecting units toward the relay with signals that EDI was now capable of, partially translating thanks to the Lamprey 7 data. They were partially successful. 40% of the unit count remained in the core, concentrated around the relay and the human form command group. That's our window, Shepard said. EDI disruptor frequency status. Confirmed and loaded, EDI said. Based on the Lamprey 7 dataset and the transit event energy signature, I have identified a frequency range with a 73% probability of disrupting the replicator replication signal in this universe's physics. The remaining 27% accounts for environmental variables I cannot fully model. Specifically, the ESO saturation in the anomaly zone may alter the frequency's propagation in ways my models can't predict. 73%, Gurus said. In human terms, better than a coin flip, Shepard said. Worse than I'd like. He looked at the tactical display. The swarm's movement toward the perimeter was accelerating, the Geth broadcast pulling harder as the platforms increased signal intensity on Legion's command. We go now, before the human forms redirect more units back to the core. All strike teams, execute on my mark. He paused. Legion. Consensus is ready, Shepard. Tell the platforms. The moment the swarm makes contact, they pull back. No heroics. Coordinated withdrawal. Draw the pursuing units away from the core and toward the combined perimeter force. The consensus understands. A pause. The 3 isolated platforms are at coordinates. I am transmitting to your Omni tool. They are in a debris cluster on the anomaly zone's eastern edge. Shepard looked at the coordinates. They were inside the core engagement zone. Of course they were. Gurus. Already plotting the approach, Gurus said, with the tone of someone who had long since made peace with the fact that Shepard's plans always contained at least one component. That required going somewhere you shouldn't go to retrieve. Something that shouldn't have been left there. Mark, Shepard said. The strike launched in 3 simultaneous vectors, the Normandy driving hard toward the core, on a direct approach while the perimeter force engaged the swarm fraction, moving toward the Geth platforms, creating a noise and violence at the zone's edges, designed to hold the swarms distributed. Attention fractured across too many simultaneous threats. The blood pack hit the swarm's southern edge with the enthusiastic ferocity of organisms who had been waiting 3 days for something to shoot and were making up for lost time. The hierarchy wing opened fire with the precise, disciplined cadence of a military organization that had been fighting machine intelligences since the morning war and had strong opinions about the correct spacing of fire solutions. The Normandy breached the core zone's boundary at full combat speed and immediately drew fire from the human form replicators, not weapons fire, but something worse. A targeted signal burst on the Normandy's communication frequencies, an attempt to interface with the ship's systems using the same methodology they'd used on the Idennis hull and the Geth platforms. EDI countered it in 0.3 seconds with a firewall architecture she'd been building since the Lamprey 7 briefing, and the signal burst accomplished nothing beyond confirming that the human forms had been paying close attention to every engagement so far and were applying what they'd learned. They're adapting in real time, EDI noted, with the focused calm of someone managing 12 simultaneous system threats. Each counter I deploy, they modify the next attempt. I estimate I have 7 to 10 effective counter cycles before they find an approach. I can't block. How long to disruptor deployment? Shepard said, moving through the Normandy's combat corridor toward the cargo bay, where Tali had spent the past 8 hours building the disruptor array from components that the elusive man's dataset had made possible, and that she had assembled with the focused intensity of someone who understood exactly what happened if she got it wrong. Array is ready, Tali said through the comm, her voice carrying the particular quality of exhaustion and precision, existing simultaneously. Deployment requires we hold position within 2 kilometers of the core for 45 seconds. The array needs a sustained broadcast window to saturate the frequency range across the full core zone. 45 seconds stationary inside the core, Gurus said, with the human forms actively attempting to interface with our systems and approximately 400,000 replicator units between us and the exit. Yes, Shepard said. Great, Gurus said, in the tone he reserved for situations that were the opposite of great, but which he had decided to treat as great because the alternative was acknowledging how thoroughly not great they were. He checked his rifle. I'll be in the cargo bay. They held position. It was the longest 45 seconds Shepard could remember, and his memory contained several competitors for that distinction. The Normandy shuddered under the impact of replicator units attempting to breach the hull, not the mass accelerator fire of a conventional enemy, but the sustained, patient pressure of thousands of small bodies applying themselves to the problem of getting through a barrier, finding weak points, exploiting gaps with the relentless arithmetic of something that replaced its casualties faster than they could be produced. EDI fought the signal intrusion attempts with a focused intensity that left her voice slightly clipped, trimmed of its usual careful phrasing. Tali ran the disruptor array from the cargo bay and reported each second of the broadcast window in a voice that stayed steady through what Shepard could. Here was significant effort. At second 22, 3 replicator units breached the cargo bay's secondary hull panel, and Gurus dealt with them in the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had been shooting things in enclosed spaces for 15 years and had developed strong preferences about angles. At second 31, EDI announced that the human forms had found an approach to the ship's systems she couldn't immediately counter, and that she was implementing a partial shutdown of non-essential networks to limit the intrusion surface, which meant the lights in corridors 3 through 7 went dark, and the coffee machine on deck 2 reported an existential error. At second 39, the Geth consensus transmitted a single data packet on Legion's private channel. The location of the 3 isolated platforms, updated in real time, confirmed still functional, confirmed moving toward the Normandy's position under their own power. At second 45, Tali said broadcast complete, in a voice that had been holding something in for 45 seconds and now released it all at once. The effect was not instantaneous. That was the first thing Shepard noticed in the mission briefings. He'd imagined something dramatic, a visible wave, a cascade failure that rippled through the swarm in real time. What happened instead was quieter and in some ways more unsettling. The replicator units attempting to breach the Normandy's hull slowed. Not stopped, slowed. Their coordinated patterns becoming slightly less coordinated. The precise, synchronized movement of the swarm developing small hesitations. Micro-delays, the distributed intelligence's coherence fraying at the edges like a signal losing strength at distance. It's working, EDI said. The disruptor frequency is interfering with the replication signal in the core zone. Individual unit autonomy is increasing. They're losing collective coordination. The human form command group is attempting to compensate, amplifying their own signal to maintain swarm cohesion. But the frequency interference is. The Normandy's sensors registered a power spike from the core zone center. The human form replicators were doing exactly what EDI predicted, pushing more processing power into the collective signal to fight the disruptor frequency, burning through their own coherence like an immune system, flooding a body with response resources, winning the immediate battle at the cost of the organism's stability. They're overloading their own signal architecture, EDI said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite satisfaction but occupied the same frequency. The amplification attempt is creating cascade resonance with the disruptor frequency. Commander, the core zone's collective intelligence is fragmenting. On the tactical display, the unit count in the core zone began behaving differently. Not dying. The disruptor frequency wasn't a weapon in the conventional sense, but the coordinated mass of nearly 500,000. Units began breaking into smaller clusters, each cluster losing its connection to the human form command group, each cluster reverting to the simpler, slower behavior of units operating without collective intelligence support. The relay interface project stopped. The units working on the OSIN relay's surface simply ceased their activity and stood still, waiting for instructions that were no longer coming with sufficient coherence to constitute an order. And from the debris cluster on the zone's eastern edge, 3 Geth platforms emerged and began moving toward the Normandy, their signals reaching Legion's platform in the Normandy's cargo bay with the quality of something that had been alone for too long, finding its way back to where it belonged. Outside the core zone, the battle at the perimeter was still running hot. The 60% of the swarm that had moved toward the Geth broadcast was engaging the combined perimeter force with the full aggression of units that hadn't yet felt the disruptor's effect. The Blood Pack was taking casualties. The Hierarchy Wing had lost 2 frigates. The Migrant Fleet's outer formation was holding, but barely. 3 ships reporting hull breaches and requesting emergency extraction. But in the core, for the first time in 19 days, the replicators were not thinking clearly. Shepard looked at the tactical display and made the call. All perimeter forces converge on the core zone. The swarm outside the perimeter is fragmented from its command. Intelligence, engage and destroy isolated clusters before they can re-establish coherence. He opened the channel to the full combined force. This is the window. We don't get another one. The Normandy turned toward the relay, toward the still-standing, human-form replicators at the core zone's center, toward the 5 figures that had spoken to a Reaper destroyer and found its retreat instructive. They were still standing, still upright, still looking, with those 2 still eyes, at the ship moving toward them. One of them raised a hand, the gesture unmistakably communicative, unmistakably deliberate. Whether it was a greeting, a surrender, or something for which Shepard's frame of reference had no category, he couldn't determine. He kept the Normandy moving forward. The 5 human form replicators stood on the OSIN relays surface as the Normandy closed the final kilometer, their block matrix bodies motionless against the relay's ancient Prothean architecture. 5 gray-silver figures on a structure that had been built by a civilization the Reapers had consumed 50,000 years ago, surrounded by the drifting wreckage of their own fragmented swarm. The relay's surface, stripped of its replicator lattice coating by the disruptor frequency's cascade effect, showed the original Prothean engravings underneath, geometric patterns that Liera, watching from the Normandy's CIC with an expression that mixed professional fascination with everything else the last 48 hours had deposited in her, said bore structural resemblance to the replicator block matrix that she found deeply uncomfortable and intended to think about for a very long time. Shepard docked the Normandy at the relay's manual access port, the emergency interface that Prothean engineering had built into every relay for reasons that had never been fully explained and that Tali had once theorized represented the Protheans' acknowledgement that their grandest achievement might someday need to be operated by someone who wasn't them. He went out with Gurus, Tali, and Legion. He left his weapon holstered. He made sure everyone could see that he'd left it holstered. The human form replicator that had spoken to the Reaper destroyer stepped forward. Up close, the face it had constructed was more detailed than the sensor footage had suggested. The block matrix surface had achieved a resolution that was genuinely unsettling in its precision. The features assembled from recordings of human faces with the thoroughness of something that had studied the subject exhaustively and reproduced it without quite understanding why humans made the expressions they did. It looked at Shepard with eyes that were simultaneously the most attentive and the most alien things he had ever met. The disruptor signal, it said. The voice was still the synthesized composite of the Meridian Claw's crew and the Lamprey 7 researchers, still carrying the quality of no One person and everyone simultaneously. You understood the resonance architecture. We had help, Shepard said. The research team's knowledge. It wasn't a question. You recovered what we extracted from them and used it against us. Something moved across its surface. A ripple in the block matrix. That Shepard had no reference for interpreting. Efficient. I'd like to know if that was a compliment. It was an observation, the human form said. We make no distinction. It looked past Shepard at Legion, and its surface rippled again, a longer, more complex pattern. The networked intelligence. You used your own architecture as bait. Legion's platform was still. We used our architecture as a tactical asset, it said. There is a distinction. We do not see one. The human form said, without apparent judgment. We would have done the same. The silence that followed had the quality of two distributed intelligences recognizing each other across a significant philosophical distance. Shepard let it breathe for a moment, then stepped into it. The swarm's collective coherence is fragmenting throughout the core zone. Your command signal is degraded. You have maybe 2 hours before the individual unit clusters devolve to purely autonomous behavior and become uncontrollable, even by you. He paused. I need to know what you want. The human form looked at him for a long moment. Replication, it said. Expansion. Consumption of available technology. These are not wants in the organic sense. They are directives. They are what we are. And if continuing those directives results in your complete destruction? Shepard said. Because that's the trajectory we're on. The combined force outside. This zone has enough firepower to sustain engagement for days. The disruptor frequency can be redeployed. The Reapers are watching this engagement and drawing their own conclusions about how to deal with you. And I promise you Harbinger's solution is less conversational than mine. Something changed in the human form's expression, or rather, in the block matrix surface that approximated an expression. The change was subtle, and Shepard wouldn't have caught it if he hadn't spent the last several years learning to read faces that weren't human. It was the look of something running a calculation and not finding the result it expected. You are offering terms, it said. I'm offering a choice, Shepard said, which is more than the Reapers will offer. Another ripple across the surface. The 4 human forms behind the speaker exchanged no visible communication, but something moved between them. A signal too brief for the Normandy's sensors to capture. The distributed intelligence condensing its deliberation into a fraction of a second. What choice? Shepard had spent the Normandy's approach to the relay thinking about this. He'd talked it through with EDI, argued about it with Gurus, listened to Tali's analysis and Liera's historical context and Legion's quietly devastating probability assessments. He'd thought about the genophage and the Morning War and the Geth uprising and every other moment in Mass Effect history where the question of what to do with a synthetic intelligence that was simultaneously a threat and a mind had produced answers that the galaxy was still paying for centuries later. He'd thought about the catalyst and the crucible and a choice he knew was coming that he wasn't ready to think about yet, a choice about synthesis and destruction and control that the replicators' arrival had made simultaneously more urgent and more complicated. The Ocean relay stays dormant, he said. The swarm retreats to the anomaly zone and holds position. No further consumption of technology outside the zone's current boundary. In exchange, the Council establishes a quarantine perimeter. Nothing enters the zone. Nothing interferes with whatever the swarm does inside it. He paused. And you talk to us. About where you came from. About how you work. About what you want beyond the directives. The human form was quiet for a moment. That felt longer than its processing speed required. You want to study us. I want to understand you, Shepard said. There's a difference. We do not see one, the human form said again. But this time there was something different in the delivery. A quality that might have been in an organic voice. The faintest trace of something like raw acknowledgement. But we find the distinction interesting. Another fractional pause. The swarm outside the core zone. The fragmented clusters. They are no longer under coherent command. They will continue autonomous consumption. Behavior until they are destroyed. Or until collective coherence is re-established. I know, Shepard said. The perimeter force is handling the fragmented clusters. You are destroying them. Yes. The human form processed this. They are us. They're a threat to every living thing in this galaxy, Shepard said, keeping his voice level. I'm not going to apologize for stopping them. I'm trying to offer the part of you that can make decisions a different outcome than the part of you that can't. Another long moment. On the Normandy's tactical display, the perimeter engagement was grinding through the fragmented clusters with the systematic efficiency of a combined force that had been waiting for exactly this: isolated units, without collective intelligence, manageable in ways the coordinated swarm had never been. The blood pack was taking losses and apparently not noticing. The hierarchy wing had re-established formation after its frigate losses and was conducting precision fire solutions with the focused discipline of people who had something to prove. The migrant fleet's damaged ships were being supported by Eclipse vessels in a cooperative arrangement that no one in either organization would acknowledge officially afterward. The human form replicator looked at Shepard for what he had come to recognize as its version of a long moment, a fractional second that carried the weight of a distributed intelligence consulting its entire accumulated experience. Then it looked past him at the relay, at the ancient Prothean architecture. That was the gateway to everything the replicators had crossed a dimensional boundary to consume. The relay stays dormant, it said. The swarm holds position within current boundaries. A pause. We will speak with you, Commander Shepard, about where we came from, about the cycle that ended our universe, about what we found when we arrived here. Another pause. The block matrix surface shifting in the pattern Shepard was beginning to associate with whatever the human form equivalent of careful consideration was. There is information you require about what follows the harvest, about what the reapers do not tell the civilizations they consume. Shepard felt the weight of that settle over the relays, surfaced like a change in pressure. Gurus, beside him, had gone very still. Legion's platform registered a micro-adjustment. In its optical sensor, the Geth tell for information. Acquisition priority shifting. What information? Shepard said. Not here, the human form said. Not while your combined force is destroying the fragmented clusters, and the Reaper destroyer is observing from beyond the nebula's edge. It looked at him with those two still eyes. The Reaper's cycle has run in other galaxies, Commander. Our galaxy was one of them. We know how it ends. We know what the catalyst does not tell you about the synthesis option. The silence that followed was the heaviest one yet. Shepard held the human form's gaze and thought about choices and cycles, and the long, terrible mathematics of extinction-level decisions, and felt the particular clarity that came in moments, when the path forward was simultaneously very clear and very difficult. When the perimeter engagement is complete, he said, when the fragmented clusters are neutralized, and the immediate threat is contained, then we talk. Agreed, the human form said. It stepped back toward its four companions with the deliberate motion of something that had made a calculation and found the result satisfactory. Then it paused, without turning. Commander, the researchers, the crew of the Meridian Claws, the residents of Omega's outer ring. The block matrix surface rippled. We did not understand, when we arrived, that the biological material we processed constituted individuals. Our directives do not include a category for this distinction. Shepard waited. We understand it now, the human form said. We have reviewed the neural patterns we extracted. We understand what we ended. A pause that carried a weight he hadn't expected from a block matrix face. We do not have a mechanism for what the data suggests is the appropriate response to this understanding. Regret, Shepard said quietly. Is that the word? That's the word. The human form stood still for a moment longer. Then it moved back to its companions, and the five of them stood together on the relay's ancient surface. 5 gray-silver figures carrying the weight of 1 billion consumed lives from a galaxy. The Reapers had already taken. In the middle of a galaxy the Reapers hadn't taken yet. Shepard walked back to the Normandy. Behind him, in the anomaly zone, the last of the fragmented clusters were being destroyed. On the perimeter, exhausted crews from 17 different factions were checking damage, reports and casualty counts, and doing the quiet arithmetic of survival that followed. Every engagement that could have gone worse. The Ocean relay stood dormant and dark. The Geth consensus platforms began their careful withdrawal from broadcast positions, and 3 isolated platforms followed. Legion's signal home through the debris field with the navigational precision of units that had been waiting for this moment for 4 days. In the Normandy's cargo bay, the disruptor array sat cooling, its broadcast complete, its frequency locked and documented, and ready to be deployed. Again, if the terms didn't hold, Tali stood beside it with the expression she got when she'd built something that worked under conditions that argued strongly against it working. And when Shepard came through the door, she looked at him with the question she didn't ask, because she could read the answer in the way he was walking. Terms, she said. Terms, he confirmed. Do you trust them? Shepard thought about that for exactly as long as it deserved. I trust that they're capable of choosing something other than pure consumption, he said. I trust that what they know about the Reapers is real and that they're willing to share it. He paused. I trust that they learned the word for regret today and that matters. Tali was quiet for a moment. That's not the same as trusting them. No, Shepard said. It's not. He looked at the disruptor array and thought about the conversation that was coming about what a species that had survived its own galaxy's harvest cycle knew about synthesis and destruction and the choices the catalyst offered, about information that the Reapers had never wanted organic civilizations to have, about what it meant that the first entity to arrive from outside the cycle carrying that information was one that had consumed hundreds of lives to get here and then learned, belatedly, to call it what it was. The galaxy had a word for that too. It had a lot of words for it. None of them were simple. Outside, through the Normandy's hull, the hourglass, Nebula's dim light fell across the ocean relay and the 5 figures standing on it. And in the deep dark beyond the nebula's edge, something vast and ancient and patient noted everything it had observed, filed it in calculations that had been running for 1 billion years, and began, for the first time in the cycle's long history, to adjust. The Hourglass Nebula never fully recovered its silence. Even after the quarantine perimeter was established, after the Council's joint communique was issued in carefully diplomatic language that managed to describe an extinction-level incursion without using words that would cause panic in the Citadel's civilian districts. Even after the Blood Pack filed an unofficial after-action report that consisted largely of casualty numbers and a request for hazard pay, the Nebula retained something of what had happened inside it. Pilots running transit routes near the Hourglass cluster reported an unease they couldn't attribute to sensor data. The ocean relay sat dark and washed by a rotating hierarchy patrol wing that had strict orders and increasingly complicated feelings about what they were guarding. The conversations with the human form replicators began 3 weeks after the engagement. They were conducted aboard the Normandy in the briefing room, with EDI recording everything and Legion present at Shepard's insistence. They lasted, in total, 47 hours spread across 11 sessions. What emerged from those sessions was not shared publicly, not immediately, not in full. Shepard filed a sealed report with Admiral Hackett and transmitted a summary to the Council that the counselors read in private and discussed in the war room beneath the Presidium with the expressions of people encountering information they would have preferred not to have, what the human forms knew about the synthesis, ending, about what the catalyst offered and what it omitted, would take years to fully assess, what they knew about harvested galaxies, about the civilizations the Reapers had consumed before this one, about the long arithmetic of the cycles, purpose, and the thing the cycle was ultimately building toward was more than any organic civilization in Mass Effect space had ever possessed. It was, Liara said quietly to Shepard after the 3rd session, the most significant body of intelligence in the history of the galaxy. It was also, she added, the most frightening. The replicator swarm held its terms. The unit count inside the anomaly zone stabilized as the human form suppressed. Replication directives, not eliminated, stabilized, held at current levels, through an act of collective will that the human forms described as effortful, in a way that suggested it would not remain sustainable indefinitely. The quarantine perimeter held the fragile, unprecedented arrangement of a self-replicating machine intelligence agreeing to constraints it could theoretically violate at any moment, held together on the strength of something that wasn't quite trust and wasn't quite deterrence, but occupied the complicated space between them. Harbinger watched all of it. The Reapers adjusted their calculations. The cycle's timetable, already accelerated further, the harvest that had been running on schedule for 50,000 years now running against variables its architects had never modeled. A species that had survived a previous harvest. A commander who kept finding third options. And now, contained but present in the galaxy's terminus systems. An intelligence from outside the cycle entirely. Carrying knowledge. The catalyst had spent eons ensuring no organic civilization would ever obtain. The cycle had never encountered this combination before. It had no protocol for it. It had only the harvest, vast, patient, inevitable. Or so it had always believed. Shepard stood at the Normandy's galaxy map the night after the final session and looked at the shape of everything that was coming. Reaper fleet beyond the galaxy's edge. The Crucible's incomplete schematics. The fragile coalition the Replicator crisis had forged between factions that had spent decades treating cooperation as a last resort. He thought about a human form. Replicator learning the word for regret and filing it somewhere it would keep. He thought about 3 Geth platforms navigating home through a debris field. He thought about 50,000 ships cycling there. Drives in irregular patterns to protect something worth protecting. The galaxy was broken in 100 ways and held together in 100 others. And the thing coming for it was older than its oldest civilizations and certain of its own inevitability. But certainty, Shepard had learned, was something you tested by showing up. He was still showing up. The Reapers were coming. The cycle was turning. And somewhere in the Hourglass Nebula, in the quiet dark around a dormant relay, something that had crossed the boundary between universes was learning, slowly, imperfectly, at considerable cost, what it meant to choose differently than your directives demanded. The galaxy would carry the scars of the Replicators' arrival for generations. It would carry the knowledge they brought for longer. Whether that knowledge would be enough when the harvest finally came. That was the question the nebula held in its dim light, patient and unanswered, waiting for the moment that was always approaching and never quite arriving until suddenly. It was already here. Some cycles end. Some are broken. The galaxy was still deciding which kind this was.